This is Philosophy Bites with me, David Edmonds.
And me, Nigel Warburton.
Philosophy Bites is available at www.philosophybites.com. The most significant philosopher of the medieval period, Thomas Aquinas, was born in what in the 13th century was called the Kingdom of Sicily. He attended several universities, among them the University of Naples. After training as a priest and joining the Dominican order, he became a theologian. He wrote on a huge range of topics, including a detailed examination of several proofs for the existence of God. But here, Anthony Kenny discusses his writings on ethics.
Anthony Kenny, welcome to Philosophy Bites.
It's pleasant to be back on the programme.
The topic we want to focus on today is Thomas Aquinas, but specifically his ethics. Before we go into that, perhaps you could sketch a little about who Aquinas was.
Yes, Aquinas lived right in the middle of the 13th century, which is perhaps the highest point of the High Middle Ages. He was a Dominican friar, spent most of his life in universities like the New University of Paris. Universities were new things then, and the begging friars and the preaching friars, Franciscans and Dominicans, they were new things as well. And between them, they more or less shaped the intellectual life of the 13th century. Aquinas' great contribution was the way in which he reconciled Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology. At the beginning of his life, Aristotle was largely forbidden by the church authorities. By the end of his life, most of Aristotle's texts were obligatory material in the universities, and it was largely due to the genius of Aquinas that this happened.
So what did Aquinas take from Aristotle when it came to his ethics?
Well, Aristotle's ethics is based most of all on the concept of happiness, that is, on what is the most worthwhile life for a human being. Aristotle thought that this was the exercise of virtues of various kinds, both ordinary virtues like courage and temperance, but also intellectual virtues like the pursuit of science and philosophy. He thought that in a full life, people would achieve their happiness by doing well what they were best at. If you think that happiness is the exercise of the different virtues, then of course you have to explain what a virtue is, why it will be enjoyable to pursue it, and so on. And many undergraduates through many generations have read Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics and learnt what Aristotle has to say about this. Now that is also the main foundation of Aquinas' ethics. It is based on happiness, eudaimonistic, as they say. But of course, being a Christian, he adds an extra level of happiness, whereas Aristotelian happiness is to be found principally, if not totally, in the present world. For Aquinas, perfect happiness awaits the blessed in heaven, but he is very much in favour of Aristotle's account of the best way to spend your life down here.
We should be absolutely clear about this for Aristotle and presumably for Aquinas as well. Happiness isn't a blissful mental state. It's not merely a sensation.
That's quite right. That is a thing that makes a big difference between most popular forms of ethics today. I suppose a very widespread form of ethics today is utilitarianism, which was founded by Jeremy Bentham, the 18th century British philosopher. Bentham agrees with Aristotle that happiness is the fundamental concept, the thing on which all morality is to be based, in his case the greatest happiness of the greatest number. But Bentham has a very different view of happiness from Aristotle and Aquinas. Both Aristotle and Aquinas thought that happiness was an activity, not a feeling, and that the supreme happiness was an intellectual activity of rational beings. Whereas for Bentham, happiness is exactly the same as sensation. He makes no difference between pleasure and happiness. Now, if you reflect on this, it makes a very big difference as to the kind of relationship you see between, say, human beings and other animals. For Aristotle and Aquinas, since happiness and virtue were the exercise of rational powers, only human beings belonged into the moral community. Whereas if the fundamental principles of ethics depend on pleasure and pain, then animals must belong to the same moral community since they can feel pleasure and pain. The fact that Aristotle and Aquinas thought animals weren't part of the moral community, it doesn't follow from that you can mistreat animals, because we can have obligations to creatures that aren't part of our own moral community. When I say they're not part of our own moral community, I mean that they don't have duties, and for Aquinas, only those can have rights who can also have duties. Aquinas, of course, didn't think God was part of our moral community either. He was above it in the way that animals were below it. But that doesn't mean that we don't have obligations to God.
How did Aquinas develop Aristotle's ideas?
Well, being a Christian, Aquinas has a number of extra virtues to add to the pagan virtues of Aristotle. The famous triad that comes in St. Paul's epistles of faith, hope, and charity. Faith, belief in the Christian revelation, hope for the Christian heaven, and charity, love for God and our neighbour. He thinks these are not in any way in conflict with the Aristotelian virtues. They're something grander but built on top and not superseding the Aristotelian virtues at all.
In Christian theology, there are absolute commands about how you should behave, the Ten Commandments, obviously. Did Aquinas believe that there were absolute prohibitions on what we could do?
Yes, he did. Before explaining that, I should say so did Aristotle. When Aristotle is expounding his doctrine of the mean, he says there are some things which there isn't the right amount of. Any amount of murder or adultery is too much. But, as you say, Aquinas is living in a context in which morality could be said to be founded on the Ten Commandments, on the notion of law. And what Aquinas does is try to put together the Judeo-Christian notion of law as a basis of morality and the Aristotelian notion of virtue as the key element in morality. Later Christian thinkers emphasized law rather than virtue right up and beyond the Reformation, and Kant, I suppose, is the apotheosis of the notion of law as the central concept of morality, law and duty. In Aquinas, the proportion is quite different, though he does discuss the law, the natural law that he thinks God implanted in all our hearts, as well as the revealed law. Much more of his ethical treatises are concerned with virtue than they are with law.